There are stories Hollywood tells you, and there are stories Hollywood buries. In the glare of the camera, Angie Dickinson was the perfect illusion. A woman built of light, laughter, and danger. She was elegance in motion, the blonde every man wanted, and the woman every actress feared. But off the screen, behind the perfume and press, Angie carried a list. Not of lovers, but of men who left marks too deep for lipstick to hide. Some she loved, some she survived. All of them she remembered. When asked late in life whether she had regrets, she smiled, the kind of smile that knows too much, and said, "Regret is a luxury for people who didn't live." She lived. Through betrayal, through humiliation, through love that curdled into resentment. Through the quiet hell of being the woman Hollywood used as proof that a woman could be both powerful and disposable. This isn't gossip. It's a record, the emotional diary of a woman who loved too deeply and paid too publicly. And somewhere in those memories, between the headlines and the heartbreak, there are 5 names. 5 men who taught her how cruel success could be. 5 ghosts that never quite left her mirror. But this is Hollywood Tapes, and here truth is never as simple as it seems. Because behind every hate, there was once love. And behind every love, a silence that still echoes. One, Burt Bacharach, the man who stole her music and her child. Before the bitterness, there was music. Before the silence, there was laughter, soft, private, full of the kind of tenderness that only exists when you still believe in happy endings. When Angie Dickinson met Burt Bacharach, she was the embodiment of golden era Hollywood, luminous, admired, untouchable. He was already a name that belonged to radios and record sleeves, a genius, the man who wrote songs that made the world feel something. Together, they were the perfect picture, the actress and the composer, beauty and brilliance, harmony and glamour. But harmony is fragile, and in their home, it began to crack. The song that never played. Burt loved his work more than he could love anyone. That was the first truth Angie learned. He composed for hours, sometimes days, disappearing into melodies that no one else could hear. She would wait dinners gone cold, candles melting into waxy ruins for a man who lived entirely in his own echo. When he looked at her, it was often through distance, not cruelty, but detachment. As if he were studying a lyric he couldn't finish. He wrote songs about love, but when it came to loving her, he was tone deaf. Angie once said in an interview, "I think he was only happy when he was creating something. And when he wasn't creating, he was gone. Gone not just emotionally, but physically." His affairs were whispered about, then laughed about, then ignored. Hollywood forgave his genius. Angie had to forgive the rest. The daughter, they couldn't save, In 1966, they had a daughter, Nikki. She was born prematurely, fragile, a child who would one day be diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, though few understood what that meant back then. Angie loved her with the desperation of someone who knew fame meant nothing without something to come home to. But Burt, he withdrew. He couldn't face imperfection. He lived in a world of perfect notes, and a child who needed more than music terrified him. Angie was left alone, a mother holding the world together with one trembling hand, a wife pretending her marriage wasn't collapsing in silence. Years later, Nikki would take her own life. And though time had already split Angie and Burt apart, the grief never left her face. When asked about it decades later, her voice trembled as she said, "I think he blamed me, and maybe I blamed him. But grief doesn't care who it belongs to. It lingers. It seeps into the corners of memory and turns every love song into an autopsy." The aftermath. After Burt, Angie changed. The light that once filled her eyes was replaced by something sharper, not bitterness, but knowledge. She had learned that genius and cruelty often share the same space, that charm can be a mask for neglect, and that love, when built on admiration, is never built to last. When she spoke of him later, she didn't use his name often. But when she did, it carried the weight of something she could never quite bury. "He gave the world his music," she once said, "but he took the sound out of my life." And somewhere between the piano keys and the silence that followed, Angie Dickinson realized that even the most beautiful song can destroy you, if you're the one it's written about. 2. Frank Sinatra, the voice that silenced her. When Frank Sinatra entered Angie Dickinson's life, he was already a constellation, a man too big for any single sky. To the world, he was the voice, the swaggering prince of mid-century America. To Angie, he was something far more dangerous, a man who made her feel both desired and invisible. They met when she was still young enough to blush at power, and he was old enough to know exactly how to use it. He called her baby before they'd even shared a drink. She laughed. He smiled. And that was the beginning of the silence that would follow her for years. The shadow of the king. Frank's world was made of smoke, whiskey, and control. Every woman in his orbit became part of the myth, decorations orbiting a sun that never stopped burning. He loved women, but only when they revolved around him. To be with Sinatra meant living in half-light. Dinner with presidents, whispers with gangsters. The glamour of being seen beside a man who owned the room. But Angie, who had spent her life being told to shine, wasn't built for shadow. She adored him that was undeniable. When he spoke, people listened. When he sang, the world stopped. But love from a man like that came with rules. Be perfect, be quiet, be grateful. And Angie, always proud, began to choke on those rules. He didn't want her opinions. He wanted her reflection. Possession disguised as love. Friends said their chemistry was electric, too alive to be comfortable. They'd fight in public, laugh seconds later, then vanish into private rooms where no one could hear the breaking. Frank loved to test loyalty. He'd insult her at parties, make her feel small just to see if she'd still smile for him afterward. Sometimes she did. Sometimes she didn't. And when she didn't, he punished her with silence. It was a silence colder than violence, the silence of a man who could erase you with one phone call. In her later years, Angie would admit that Sinatra was the great love of my life. But she never said it with joy. She said it the way survivors speak about wars. Because love with Frank Sinatra wasn't intimacy. It was gravity. You didn't hold him. He pulled you in. And once you were close enough, escape was almost impossible. The goodbye that never happened. They never really ended. Frank Sinatra never let anything end. He just vanished when he was finished. When Angie married another man, he sent a single rose with a note that read, "You'll miss me every time someone opens a door for you." And he was right. For years afterward, she compared every man to him. His confidence, his danger, his scent of smoke and loneliness. But what she never admitted, even to herself, was that Sinatra didn't just define what love was for her. He defined what she'd never allow it to be again. She once said, "Frank was the first man who made me feel small. And I've never forgiven him for how much I liked it." Frank Sinatra was a storm disguised as a serenade. And Angie Dickinson was the woman who stood too close to the music. When the song was over, she was still humming it, even as the silence grew louder. 3. Jack Webb, the producer who owned her image. Before Burt Bacharach. Before the fame that made her a symbol. Before the magazine covers and late-night interviews, there was Jack Webb. He wasn't the kind of man who chased beauty. He chose it, possessed it, directed it. A producer, a perfectionist, a builder of illusions, the man behind Dragnet, and the first man who ever made Angie Dickinson believe she was being sculpted rather than loved. When they met, she was still finding her footing in a city that promised everything and delivered heartbreak wrapped in flowers. He was older, already powerful, already tired of women who said no. Jack Webb didn't pursue Angie with charm. He pursued her with certainty. He told her what role she'd take, what colors she should wear, how she should walk into a room if she wanted people to remember her. At first, she mistook his control for confidence. In Hollywood, control looked like love, especially to a young actress who had been told that obedience was a form of gratitude. The marriage of performance. They married in 1952. Photographs from the time show a smiling couple, the perfect mid-century dream, the disciplined creator and his radiant muse. But what the cameras couldn't see was that the set never ended. Even at home, Angie was still performing. Jack would give her notes after dinner. Critiques. Instructions. Don't tilt your chin that way when you laugh. Keep your voice lower. People listen harder when you whisper. She learned to adapt. To turn herself into the woman he imagined her to be. But inside, something started to wither. The part of her that had once felt free. That had once believed she could exist without a script. Jack didn't hit her. He didn't need to. He rewrote her instead. The price of perfection. When Dragnet became a hit, Jack became obsessed with order. He timed his meals, his meetings, his wife. He treated marriage like a production schedule, and Angie was the star who was never allowed to improvise. The marriage began to crack under the weight of his expectations. She tried to fight back gently, quietly, the way women were trained to in the 1950s, but Jack mistook her exhaustion for defiance. Once, during an argument, he told her, "You wouldn't be anyone without me." The words were simple, but they sank deep, deeper than any insult, because a part of her believed them. That's the cruelty of control. it makes you question your own authorship. The exit. After 4 years, Angie walked away. No drama, no public tears. Just an ending written in small gestures, a packed suitcase, a locked door, a silence that lasted longer than any argument could. When reporters asked why, she said, "We were both very good at pretending." Jack never forgave her for leaving. He remarried, divorced, remarried again. But in interviews, his voice always tightened when her name came up. Angie, on the other hand, learned something vital from him, something she would carry into every love that followed. That being seen is not the same as being known. And sometimes, the most dangerous prisons are the ones built from admiration. Jack Webb gave her discipline, visibility, and a stage. But in the end, she didn't want to be someone's creation. She wanted to be her own chaos. And that chaos, that hunger to reclaim her identity, would lead her straight into the arms of men who mistook independence for challenge. 4. Larry King, the voice behind the curtain. By the time Larry King came into Angie Dickinson's orbit, the spotlight had softened. The golden glow of 1960s stardom had cooled into something quieter, something more dangerous. Angie was no longer the ingenue, no longer the studio's perfect reflection of what a woman should be. She was older, wiser, unashamed. And Larry King, sharp-tongued, curious, eternally hungry for secrets, was drawn to that. To him, she wasn't just a guest. She was a story, a living archive of Hollywood's ghosts, and the kind of woman who could make even silence feel scandalous. He admired her, of course, but Larry King's admiration was a kind that dissected. He didn't want to love her. He wanted to understand her, to turn her pain into conversation. The interview that wasn't. Their first meeting wasn't romantic. It was professional. An interview that was supposed to last 20 minutes, stretched into 3 hours. The cameras were off. The questions got darker. The tone got personal. Larry had that rare ability to make you forget the world was watching, to make confession feel like dialogue. He asked her about Sinatra, about Bacharach, about regret, and Angie, for reasons she never fully understood, answered. She spoke softly, honestly, and when it was over, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Relief. But relief in Hollywood is always short-lived. The public undressing. Weeks later, pieces of their conversation began appearing in print. Quotes, anecdotes, moments she thought were private. She had trusted a journalist, and the journalist had done what journalists do. He used her story to feed an audience hungry for ghosts. She didn't call him, didn't demand a correction, didn't curse his name in interviews. Instead, she went silent again. But when they crossed paths later, Larry smiled, half guilty, half charming, and said, "You tell the truth too beautifully to hide it." It was meant as a compliment. It sounded like a theft. The line between curiosity and cruelty. They would remain acquaintances, sometimes warm, sometimes wary. He respected her more than most, but never enough to leave her story alone. Every few years, he'd bring her back on the show, always circling the same wounds, asking the same impossible questions. Do you think Sinatra ever really loved you? Do you regret leaving Burt? Were you happy? That last question, it was the one that always made her pause, because happiness was never what she had been searching for. She had wanted meaning, and meaning in Hollywood is a luxury few survive long enough to find. The aftertaste of exposure. Larry King was never her lover, but he was one of the few men who left a mark that wasn't physical. He turned her into an echo of herself, a story retold until the truth no longer mattered. And in a strange way, that hurt her more than betrayal ever could. Because Angie Dickinson had spent her life trying to control her image. But in the end, it wasn't a director or a lover who stripped it away. It was a man with a microphone, and the patience to wait for her to speak. When asked years later if she resented him, she smiled and said, "No, I just learned that silence was the only real privacy left." And for the rest of her life, that's exactly what she kept. 5. Robert Evans. The public humiliation. By the late 1960s, Hollywood had changed, and so had Angie Dickinson. The glamour had teeth now. Every interview, every headline, every red carpet photograph felt like a negotiation. And into that glittering chaos walked Robert Evans, producer, dealmaker, and master of illusion. He was the golden boy of the new Hollywood part businessman, part seducer, part myth in a tailored suit. He didn't chase love. He acquired it. To him, romance was a contract written in charm and ambition. When he turned his attention toward Angie, she knew exactly what he was. She just didn't care. After a decade of being controlled, corrected, and consumed by other men, Evans felt different fast, dangerous, almost modern. He didn't ask her to be perfect. He asked her to be visible. And visibility, for a fading star, can feel a lot like salvation. The deal disguised as desire. Their connection began in the boardrooms of Paramount. She was there for a role. He was there to decide if she still mattered. The conversation quickly became personal, all velvet words and polished wit. Evans had that rare skill. He could make every woman feel like she was the most important project of his career. And for a little while, Angie let herself believe it. Dinners turned into late-night phone calls, and the phone calls into something less definable, a negotiation that wore the mask of affection. He introduced her to executives, whispered about scripts, promised comebacks. And though she told herself she didn't need him, she began to orbit him anyway. Hollywood had taught her that love and opportunity often arrived in the same tuxedo. The betrayal. One night, at a private gathering in Bel Air, Robert was in rare form, charming, drunk, surrounded by people who needed him more than they liked him. Someone asked about Angie, and he smirked the kind of smirk that burns slowly. "She's a dream on screen," he said. "But some dreams look better from a distance." The room laughed. Angie was standing in the doorway. He saw her, froze for a second, then lifted his glass as if to toast the damage he'd just done. That was the moment she understood. He hadn't been courting her heart. He'd been curating his power. In Hollywood, nothing was more valuable than being the man a woman like Angie Dickinson had once trusted and then regretted. The fallout. She left the party without a word. The next morning, the tabloids had the story. Evans and Dickinson, love on the rocks. He had made her humiliation public, and she refused to give him the satisfaction of confirming or denying a thing. For weeks she hid. But when she reappeared, she did so on her own terms, elegant, composed, dangerous again. A journalist asked if she'd ever work with him. She smiled faintly and said, "Some men build studios, others build illusions. I prefer my reality unproduced. It was her quiet revenge, a line sharp enough to cut, but graceful enough to be quoted for years. The lesson. Robert Evans represented the new Hollywood, the one that traded intimacy for publicity. And Angie, who had spent her career balancing both, finally understood the difference between exposure and power. He taught her that humiliation can be currency, but dignity, once lost, is almost impossible to buy back. When asked about him decades later, she didn't speak his name. She just said, "Every woman in this town has a story that ends with a man like that." Robert Evans wasn't her greatest heartbreak. He was her education. The man who proved that fame and cruelty could look identical under the same light. 6. The ones she never named. There are names Angie Dickinson never spoke. Men who existed not in photographs or interviews, but in the half-remembered spaces between career and survival. Men who didn't need headlines because their power lived in silence. Hollywood is built on such shadows. Faces without credit lines. Voices that shape fates from behind studio doors. And for every love Angie admitted to, there were 3 more she buried under grace. Not because she feared them, but because she refused to give them immortality. The hidden years. In the late 1970s, Angie Dickinson had become something new. Not the fresh-faced beauty, not the producer's muse, but the rarest creature Hollywood had ever made. A woman in control of her own narrative. Or so it seemed. Behind closed doors, she was still paying the price for every man she'd ever challenged. The offers grew smaller, the scripts thinner, the directors younger, bolder, crueler. She'd enter a meeting and feel it immediately, the shift in tone when they remembered who she had been. The woman who had refused to age quietly. The woman who had walked away from powerful men and survived. And in a business that thrived on control, a woman like that was dangerous. The ghosts in the room. There were producers who promised roles in exchange for silence. Studio heads who wanted her name attached to their films, but only if she could be attached to their reputations first. She learned to smile through it, to dodge without confrontation, to turn propositions into anecdotes and move on. But some wounds never healed clean. They became habits, a hand that trembled before signing a contract, a laugh that sounded a little too rehearsed, a voice that lowered whenever truth came too close. When asked once if she'd ever faced harassment, she said, "Let's just say I was in the wrong rooms at the right times." Then she changed the subject. That was her brilliance. She could turn pain into mystery, and mystery into control. The price of survival. Angie Dickinson never played the victim. That was her rule. The moment you became a victim in Hollywood, you disappeared. So she turned her silence into armor. She refused to name names, not because she feared revenge, but because she understood the game too well. A woman who exposes men loses her story. A woman who withholds it becomes legend. And Angie, always the actress, always the tactician, chose legend. The quiet reckoning. In her later years, when the industry began to reckon with its own ghosts, the unspoken violence, the whispered coercions, the decades of women told to smile and endure, Angie was asked if she wanted to say anything. She shook her head. "They know who they are," she said softly. And that's enough. It wasn't bitterness. It was wisdom. The kind that comes from watching the same story play out for 50 years, just with new names and better lighting. She had spent her life balancing truth and survival, and by the end, she understood something that few ever do. That silence, when chosen, isn't surrender. It's sovereignty. The men she never named still haunt the history of Hollywood. But they do so without faces, without glory, without her acknowledgement. And that, for Angie Dickinson, was the sweetest revenge of all. 7. The last frame of Angie Dickinson. There comes a point in every legend's life when the lights dim and the applause becomes memory. When the cameras stop clicking and what's left is the silence, not the cruel kind, but the kind that finally feels like peace. For Angie Dickinson, that moment came quietly. No scandal, no spectacle. Just a woman sitting by a window in Beverly Hills, watching the sun fall the same way it always had. Gold, warm, fleeting. The woman who had once been desired by kings of cinema, who had dined with presidents and danced with devils, had become something rarer, a survivor who no longer needed to be seen. The reflection. She would watch her old films sometimes, flipping through channels late at night, and catch a glimpse of herself, young, sharp, luminous, smiling a smile the world never questioned. And she'd whisper almost tenderly, "Poor girl, she didn't know yet." What she didn't know was that fame is a contract, one written in invisible ink and blood. That every role, every romance, was a trade between visibility and ownership. The world had adored her, but it had never really known her. And in that anonymity, she found something sacred. Freedom. Not the freedom of youth, or fame, or rebellion, but the quiet kind that comes from surviving your own mythology. The weight of memory. People still asked her, even in her 80s, about the men. Frank, Burt, Jack. Names that clung to her like unwanted perfume. She would smile politely, change the subject, or say something disarming, because she had learned long ago that truth was a private language, and most people didn't speak it. When a journalist once asked her if she still believed in love, she laughed. Of course. I just stopped expecting it to last. It wasn't cynicism. It was wisdom, the kind that comes from knowing that love and damage often come in the same package, just wrapped differently depending on who's holding it. The curtain call. Toward the end, Angie withdrew from Hollywood altogether. She no longer chased premieres or nostalgia interviews. She preferred the company of a few loyal friends, a glass of white wine, and the comfort of being a mystery again. When asked if she missed the spotlight, she said, "I gave it everything I had. Now it's someone else's turn." And perhaps that's what makes her story different. She didn't fade. She chose to step away. The same woman who had been written, directed, and owned finally wrote her own ending. The last frame. Imagine her now, older, softer, the world's noise far behind her. A window open, a late breeze carrying the smell of gardenias. Somewhere, on a dusty shelf, an old reel spins. Rio Bravo, Policewoman, Ocean's 11. Her voice, her walk, her laughter. Still there, frozen in light. She may have hated 5 men, but she survived 100. And in the end, she didn't need revenge. She had something better. She had memory. And she had the last word. I was never the good girl. I was the honest one. And in Hollywood, that's the hardest part to play.